I can't. Looks like there's just us. Oh, here comes people. Good. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to just let folks make their way into the room and we'll get started here in just a minute or two. Folks are trickling here. We'll get started shortly. Just 1 minute after, welcome. If you've just joined us, we're just going to wait another minute or so to let folks arrive. You know, it's interesting with our virtual world now. Remember how we were all taught to arrive early, right? If you're not, if you're early, you're on time. If you're on time, you're late. That's completely different now with these virtual meetings. And I've noticed that's kind of trickling back over into our in-person meetings as well. So we're all just a little bit just used to coming a little bit late.
At least we don't have to get name tags and be waiting
and go through all that, right? And here we are right on the screen. We all know who we are. Okay, so it's a couple minutes after noon, and just to honor your time, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the 5th and final presentation in our series, Building a High-Performing Development Program. We thank you for attending today, and just wanted to remind you that Alex will be sending all attendees a link to today's recording, and at that link you'll find recordings for our previous talks as well. My name is Diana Gordon, and I'm the president of ARCS Foundation Oregon, a women-founded, women-led nonprofit organization that raises money to support the best and brightest PhD students in STEM fields at OHSU, OSU, and the University of Oregon. I'll pop our website URL and my personal email into the chat in the event that you'd like to learn more about us. This series of talks has been designed by Lori Slaughter, the Executive Director of ARCS Foundation Oregon. Lori joined us in 2022, bringing with her 25 years of experience in the areas of high-impact philanthropy, major gifts, development operations, and endowments. We are delighted to share her with the wider nonprofit community. I'll turn the virtual program over to her now to introduce today's topic and today's speaker. The topic is Grant Seeking, an overview of the funding environment. Lori?
Thank you, Diana, and thanks everyone for taking your lunch hour to be with us today. I'm delighted to welcome a new colleague in my world, Carol Schmeike. Carol and I have been, I think we've known each other for probably over a year now. Carol is the development director for ARCS Foundation down in Northern California. And I think she's coming off of an event last night. So I appreciate you coming after you do all of the work last night, and I hope it was successful. Carol comes to us with over 16 years of grant writing experience. She has been a consultant, but she's also raised funds directly for at-risk youth and conservation efforts and in higher education as well. She served as interim, before coming to ARCS, she served as interim director of UC Santa Cruz's Corporate and Foundation Relations Office. So I'm really delighted that she'll be adding her wisdom to our talk today. As Diana mentioned, we're going to provide an overview of the grants environment. And our focus is really going to be on foundations that where we're required to submit a formal proposal. So that can be a community foundation, a larger family foundation, or private foundation. We'll also talk about the infrastructure needs of an organization that is to help it get ready to do grant seeking. Government funding in the form of grants and contracts is a totally different beast, and we will not be talking about that today. I think when we if we do want to talk about those in the future, our president-elect Rachel Dresbeck, who was on this call, can probably whip up some good slides for us and walk us through that. But we're not going to be talking about that today. The format of today's discussion is going to be similar to the one that we did prior to this in major gifts. It's going to be conversational. We're not going to kill you with a big slide deck. And as always, we welcome your questions and comments. So please pop those in the chat and we'll bring them into the discussion throughout the session. So if you'll remember in our first session back in January, we looked at Giving USA data for 2022. And that report showed that foundation giving made up 21% of all giving in that year. And that equaled to about $105 billion. In that same year, total assets that were held in private foundations topped 1.2 trillion. I'm trying to get my head around that kind of money, but that's a lot of money. As a reminder, the IRS requires foundations to distribute a minimum of 5% of their total assets annually, and most foundations stick around that that percentage. Unlike ARCs, I'm proud to say that we give out 25% or thereabouts of our total assets every year. So we're way ahead, and we're modeling hopefully good behavior for other foundations in the future. So obviously, with that kind of money, any well-rounded fundraising program is going to want to include grant seeking in it. It's one of the higher ROI disciplines in fundraising. Now, that said, I want to touch on a few challenges and some trends that we're seeing in the space, and then we'll get down and pull Carol into the conversation to talk about some more specific things. So some of the challenges that we face in grant seeking, the biggest one is competition. We talked about 1.5 million nonprofits in the US. That's a lot of competition. Here in Oregon, we have about 40,000 nonprofits. So there's a whole lot of need and not enough money to cover that need. So that's a big issue for us. There are also challenges with the variety of grants, processes, and timelines that we have to face. Every funder has a different way of doing RFPs and evaluating proposals and then delivering them out to the community. Some are even still invitation only, which is a closed door to many nonprofits. So that is also a challenge. Clearly, this issue is a cumbersome and time-consuming process for grant seekers. You have to stay on top of, many different workflows and timelines and needs from funders, so you can make a proposal that is competitive. Also, I've seen in the past that funders don't always understand a lot of the social issues that nonprofits are trying to address. So that's a stumbling block as well. In the past, and I see this changing a little bit, which is nice, but typically private funders are risk averse, so they avoid funding new startup nonprofits who may have a new and innovative way of solving problems. I mean, I think when I first started in this business, most funders wouldn't even look at you if you weren't 3 years old or older. I don't see that as much anymore, but I still think that affects new nonprofits. There's also a lot of lack of clarity and consistency in what we see as funding interest, stated funding interest versus actual funding. So, we'll go on a website and we'll see the mission or the funding interest, and then we'll look at their 990s, and the organizations that they are funding don't even match what they say they want to fund on their website. So that can be confusing and put you in a position of really not understanding if you're going to make a competitive proposal. A lot of foundations, at least here in Oregon, take a spray and pray approach, which means they give a whole lot of they give a little bit of money to a whole lot of nonprofit organizations, and it really, diminishes impact on any one cause. So that's certainly a challenge. And then, of course, as with everything in life, everything changes. We have some funders here in Oregon who stop funding for a year or two while they do strategic planning. And for a state as small as ours, with a small funding community, that can be pretty challenging and devastating for those nonprofits that would have otherwise been supported by those foundations. Now, all of that said, there are some really positive trends that I'm seeing in the grant space. And the first one is trust-based philanthropy. And if you haven't heard of this, you might Google it. There's a great article this morning in the Stanford Social Innovation Review on this concept. It's really taking more of a collaborative approach for funders, instead of I'm the big foundation and you're the nonprofit that needs money and there's a power imbalance. Trust-based philanthropy is an approach that says, oh, well, you are nonprofit, you're providing services, you're doing all of these wonderful things. I trust that you know what you're doing, and I'm going to help support that if you're aligned. So Mackenzie Scott also is a really good example of this. She doesn't put a lot of designations or restrictions on her giving, and she makes pretty large gifts to institutions that can be real game changers. Another thing I've seen is increased funding for capacity building and operations. In the Pacific Northwest, Murdoch Trust is known for this. And in fact, my position was supported and still is supported by a Murdoch grant. So they see the importance of infrastructure and staffing for nonprofits. So I see that also in other funders as well. There are also trends in community-based grant selection. In the past, and it's still mostly true today, that a group of trustees would get together and hear from a few program officers about which grant submissions they think are most competitive and fit with their funding interest, and then they would make those decisions internally. If you look at organizations like Liberated Capital, I think that's in the Northeast. Edgar Villanueva is amazing, and he runs that organization. This is a shift where community members who might be some of the folks who benefit from grants in their communities would be actually sitting around a table and talking about impact and looking at grant proposals to make those selections. So I love seeing that, and it really makes a further connection between the funder and the cause that they're trying to impact. And then the other good trend that I'm seeing is increasing focus on equity issues. Most funders, at least here in Oregon, are interested in a nonprofit organization's progress on building an equitable infrastructure and policies and doing their work in that way. A great example of this is Intel Foundation. So if you want to see their statement, it's right on Intel Foundation's homepage. It's about a page and a half or so, and it's really powerful, and it really tells you what they're thinking and how the funding, private funders and corporate funders are trying to drive change around equity. So, now that I've kind of painted a bit of a picture for you about the current environment, I want to shift a little bit and talk about what organizations need in terms of their capacity to successfully engage in grant seeking. So, Carol, I'm going to stop talking now, and I want to punt this to you to tell us how you might advise organizations that are thinking about getting started in grants or want to do it well. What do they need to have in place, and what do they need operationally in order to be successful?
Great. Lori, thank you first for inviting me to the conversation. I'm excited to be a part of this and to help lay some of this groundwork for everybody. And Establishing a grant program does require quite a number of things to have in place and keep updated. So going into any effort to get a grant development program off the ground, it's helpful that you just have in mind that it requires some time and various conversations with leadership in different parts of your organization. And as I go through some of these points, Lori, jump in, add your thoughts and experience, please. So I know you've got a lot in this space as well. Okay, so let's start with some of the money side of things, since that's what we're pursuing. Key to your success is really having a strong financial case. And this shows up in your organizational budget, your project budget, and your organizational financial statements. Your organizational budget just presents all the all the revenues and expenses that go into making your organizational activities happen. What you're presenting in a grant proposal is really your organizational budget for the fiscal year of the project that you're proposing. And it should be in a form that's easy to understand so that it's not, covering 5, 6, 12 pages. It should be a really easy document to get into and understand what is happening in your organization. The project budget is where I'm going to spend a little bit more time because it does really need to be as robust as possible. In fact, once I read in a grant writing guidebook that one program officer said that before they ever even went to the narrative section, they looked at the project budget because they thought a project budget should be able to tell the story of what it is you want to fund on its own. So adequate attention to your project budget is crucial. So what does a project budget include? It needs to have a revenue section and an expense section. And in the revenue section, there should be 3 to 4 columns, total cost column, a confirmed revenue column, a pending revenue column, and most likely you'd have a planned revenue column if you didn't already have enough, enough number of funding sources that you have already reached out to, but they're planned, so you're signaling that they are going to be ones you'll be reaching out to. And then the course.
Carol, can I ask some questions around that? Because I've seen this in many ways, and I love what you're saying about putting in what is planned and what has been received already, because what I've heard from funders is, oh, we don't want to be the only ones. And how can we leverage our grant to get more money? So if you don't have this, what do you think they think if you just give them the budget of the expense without showing all of that?
You're not giving them the full picture, so they don't know where they're coming into the game. You're right. There are funders that say, well, I want to be the seed funder. I want to help get something started, or I want to see everyone else come in and I will make the final gift, right? So there are personalities, I suppose you could say, to the funders' interest in where they come into the funding, into the piece, into the funding picture. So clearly being able to show your plan for funding what's already come in will help signal to them where they are in this picture.
And do you define individual giving versus other types of funding? Because some foundations want to see a good percentage of your work being funded by the community itself, and to them that's individual. Is that line up with how you think about this, Carol?
As a matter of fact, yes. So you've got your columns. So across your rows will be your various revenue buckets, your revenue sources. And that would include individuals, or might be your endowments, corporation funding, other foundation funding, in-kind, fee-for-service, all of those different buckets. You want to show that if you have revenues from those sources, don't include them as a row if you don't have them or don't plan to have them, but include any buckets as a row to show that you've got this diversity of funding. Like most things, if you have all your eggs in one basket, that can feel a little uncomfortable to some funders. But it really, that distribution just depends on your particular organization. One of those rows should be this grant request row. So you've got that really separated from the rest. Let's see, also in your expense section are 2 subsections. And this is where I've seen some challenges here, but you really want to separate out your staffing from your project expenses. There are some funders that you can move money within staffing or within your project expenses, but you don't generally move money when you're in your project, when you're executing your project, from project expenses into staffing or vice versa. That's a little bit of a red flag when you're reporting out your actuals. If you do have a change in staffing funding, that you should probably consider telling your funder, the foundation, that you have this change so that they're aware of that. But having said that, so in the staffing section, you're going to have your titles of each of your staff who are implementing the project, and do not list staff who are not part of the implementation. And these would include your accountant, your bookkeeper, the person who does your information technology, your communications team, and the development team. Because these are costs that are expressed in the budget's indirect cost section, which I'll mention in a moment. So you've got your staffing section, then you go in your project section, and really this is your materials, your transportation, your mileage costs. It could be food or rental fees if you're doing an event, things like that. So anything that is not staffing but is directly related to implementation of your project.
Carol, do you have an example of a project budget that you might be willing to share with me, and we'll share it back out to the group, just so we have a format of it?
I don't have that off the top of my head, but I will find it in a pause section and I'll pull that out.
Great. No problem. I mean, you don't have to do it right now, but I'm just thinking that that would be good to look at.
Yeah, I agree. Indirect cost rate is something that is an interesting opportunity here, and does require an organization to give it some thought, because it can be a little bit nebulous. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but for our purposes today, we can consider the indirect rate really as a percentage of the project budget for those organizational costs that are indirectly, that's the name, indirect costs, that support the project. Another name you might hear is overhead costs, so indirect or overhead. For an organization that has more than one project, you can think of an indirect cost then as those organizational services that would still exist if the project disappeared. So as I mentioned, those are your bookkeeper costs. That would still, if your project ended and you had another project happening, you would still probably have a bookkeeper going. Calculating the indirect cost can be quite an art. I worked for a nonprofit a number of years back whose CFO was a genius at calculating indirect costs. He was going to recover every possible cost, and he created a budget template that calculated a rate on every project expense entered. It was so extraordinarily complex, and I don't recommend that approach unless you can really afford someone who could do all those algorithms. But what it shines a light on is how important it is to capture indirect costs, because without those adequately represented in your budget and paid for by donors, it's really hard, if not impossible, to sustain those supporting services. The simplest approach is really just to add up the cost of the total indirect services equal to the length of your project's timeline, so over a course of a year, or if it's a 2-year grant request, and then estimate the percentage of time given for all of those costs as a percentage of your project budget total.
So Carol, for small organizations like ours, do you assign a percentage of your time to the project as well? Because you are likely going to be wearing a lot of hats, and getting the money is one of them, but also delivering on the service or the function is also something that you will likely do. How do you think about that?
That is a great question, because I think we've been uncertain in this, with ARC's organization in particular. Our primary activity is fundraising. And so it's been a question in my mind as to whether or not that's a direct activity. Do I list development staff, the paid staff in that staffing space when historically that does never show up in a project budget? I don't yet have the answer to that. I'm not sure, because a funder who doesn't yet know us would look at that and wonder exactly, why is that staffing person here? Why is that development person here in this space? We do have a strong case to include it as a direct activity, because, but it's just so unusual that it might raise a little bit of a flag of a question. I don't know that it would deter anybody, but it would certainly raise a question because it would be unusual. So I still, jury's out on that, and I'm not quite sure where I would land yet. We've gone both routes.
Right. It's in my head to think about as a
Yeah.
part of our way
Yeah.
forward as well. So, I think about all the time I spend on doing workflows around our scholars and the awards and delivering those awards and matching them to donor funds and all of that. That can be time consuming when we're in season. And so, I don't have an answer. I'm going to just continue to mull this around in my head. But, unlike your example of the fundraising piece, I'm kind of flipping that on its head, and the fundraising piece is what I do as well. But this is the other hat that I wear, and it takes quite a bit of time. So, building an indirect cost versus a direct cost for my time in doing that, it's going to be, I'm going to look to our treasurer and other people who can do that mathematical gymnastics to help us come up with something that feels genuine, but also tells a story of what it really cost to deliver this to the community.
Yes, yeah. It is, executive director work is often not a line item in a budget, but in a small organization, there's direct activities that you are doing. So that is really the key, is to think about the direct activities that are being implemented by whatever staff person is doing that. And in our case, it is just a little bit unusual, and worth thinking it through with your treasurer or with other leadership, and hopefully being able to talk with the funder about it, so that you've had a conversation with them ahead of time before you're submitting any grant. And they can help guide you on that, for sure.
Thank you.
Wrapping up, absolutely, your project budget should have budget notes. It's super critical. This is where you can explain, and I mentioned my story before about this program officer going to the budget to see, because if you got good budget notes, they should be able to understand what your activities are and how much of the activities are happening. So for staffing, this would include, what is the FTE? What is the estimate, I always know it as FTE. Now I can't think of the
Full-time employee.
Full-time, thank you, full-time employment of each staff involved with the project, and what their essential duties are that are related to the grant. So this, again, if you have 10% of your time is doing some XYZ activities then you can make that case there, explaining that. In the project expense section, you would include any details you can provide. For example, with transportation, it would include a mileage rate. Usually that's the same as the IRS rate, and an estimated number of miles that would be traveled and the purpose for that travel. So for example, we bus in scholars to our big annual event. They come from far away, and so we want to absorb the cost of that. If I were putting that in a grant, that would be an explanation of, we're covering X amount of mileage for students, or the bus, the cost of renting the bus, etc. Printing materials, those are harder to itemize, but at least you can mention, well, this is for our marketing, or it's our curriculum material for the program that we're implementing, whatever that might be. The last thing for your project budget I want to mention is the size of the ask. If your total project budget need is $100,000, let's say, very few foundations want to know that they're going to be asked to cover 100% of that. They don't even want to know that they're going to cover 50% of that. The large majority of foundations are going to be interested in somewhere 30% or less. So just be aware that as a percentage of your overall ask, don't ask to one funder for all or even most of the cost of your funding, which means you're going to be submitting a number of proposals to build up your, to meet your total funding need, and including the realization that they will get a number of rejections in the process. All right, well, that's the organizational budget, project budget, and then the other money side of things is your financial statements for the organization. That's inclusive of your statement of activities, your balance sheet, your income and expenses. These are often needing to be audited, often requested, and it depends on your revenues. Sometimes they say, well, we don't need a formal audit, but you know, you should have you should know, get from your treasurer or your finance people that those statements of activities and have those on hand. So we've addressed the money side. Now we go to the narrative. That's always fun. If you like to write stories and such, that's always my favorite part of grant writing, because I get to weave a narrative. And to begin, we need to make a case. We need to position this project in relationship to the interests of the funders. A case for support signals to the funder that your organization understands the challenge or the opportunity that it seeks to address or that it's trying to respond to, and why it's appealing to the foundation for help. It needs to really understand and be supported by hard evidence rather than general statements. I've seen many case statements that just sort of we intuitively know that this is a good thing to do in the world, it's going to help the world, but we need a little more evidence to support that. For example, a recent grant I worked on was for a local family foundation that had as part of its mission ensuring the vitality of the Bay Area. So given that much of the vitality of this region where I'm in is linked to science and technology, I found and quoted data about how much of the Bay Area economy was tied to those fields that laid the foundation for me to talk about how supporting ARC scholars contributes to a healthy, thriving local economy. So that's one example. And after your case statement, you'll go into the narrative to detail your project, which is really the who, the what, the how, when, where. You've already said the why, that was in your case statement. And then you end your narrative with metrics, a description of how you'll know the project was successful. And there's generally two kinds of metrics you want to be able to speak to. One is outputs. These are the quantitative metrics. These are the counts of things. How many people received support? How many people attended an event? How many people were helped? Or in ARC's case, it's how many scholars did you fund, right? The other metric is outcomes, which is more qualitative. What changed in the life of the people you are supporting? And once you've decided on what you'll measure, you'll need to make sure you can clarify how you're going to measure that. What will be your indicators of success? And tell the funder how you're going to get that data, collect that information. Following the narrative, there may be some number of additional materials that a foundation is interested in having, and this varies. So we're just going to go through this broadly because it may or may not apply to a particular funder. But nearly all will all ask for your board list with affiliation and demographics. That's really important and may take some time to collect. At a minimum, if you've got mostly retired people on your board, that's okay. Say that they're retired. If you can reference the last company or the last place they worked, that's all the better. Foundations really just are interested in getting the depth and breadth of the organization's leadership. For many years now, and especially in recent years, they've been interested in the diversity of perspective among its leadership. So they are also asking for things like gender, race, and types of employment and such. And along these lines, if your organization has a DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion plan, that is also of growing interest. There is hope from many foundations to understand that organizations are recognizing the the value of understanding the diversity of perspectives that are brought to the organization in its board capacity and in staffing capacity. Another piece of material to have on hand is your strategic plan. This signals to the funder that your organization is doing self-reflection work, that it's using the information that it's learning along the way and looking into the field of, you know, whatever field you're working in, and looking ahead, planning and demonstrate that you're planning for your sustainability and or growth. And then getting towards just some management, data management is you're going to need to have a strong grant development, to have a strong grant development program. You're going to want to have a modern CRM tracking system. Now, I've used basic spreadsheets before. I even used a spreadsheet at the university, surprisingly, but that had to be in, parallel to our full-on database. But if you're only, applying to a few grants in a given year, you could probably manage with an Excel spreadsheet. But what's key is something, Laura, you said earlier, dates, dates, dates. Those are incredibly important to a funder, is that you are on time with your reports, on time with your submissions for whatever it is they need. And you need to put those dates in your staff calendar so that they know that there is a reporting deadline coming, and that if they are not on track with their tasks, then that you can have some leadway to be able to communicate back to the funder that we're going to be delayed, we need a little bit more time, whatever it is. Communication with your program officer is critical to building that and sustaining that relationship. It is less important that you might miss a deadline, rather than more important that you communicate that you are going to miss a deadline, rather than miss it and hope they didn't notice. Research tools, well, we'll get into that in a minute. But yes, the research tools, how do you find those needles in a haystack? Yeah, that's an art in and of itself. And we'll talk about that in a minute.
Carol, I had a quick question about the board list. So I've seen this done both ways, and I want to get your opinion on it. So I went through a process of adding credentials for our board members because we support PhD students. I thought it was important that we highlight those board members who have that level of education, and then other things like MBAs and CPAs, other things that a nonprofit needs to run efficiently. So what do you think about that? Do you think that's important still, or is that passé?
No, I would agree. I think having credentials can be helpful. Again, while we don't select our scholars, I'm speaking from ARCS Northern California. We don't select our scholars, but we do have many people that are in the science field on the board and in our membership, right? So I think being able to express to the donors, to the funders anyways, that this is, we have this population of PhDs that have this degree of interest. I think it just underscores that this is an organization that has a sophistication of interest in the field that we're doing. Now, that may not be as critical if you're working outside of science, outside of STEM. But I think what's key, what can be helpful is the organization, being able to tell the funder what organization or what company the board member or the staff person has worked for. So you can see that there is a degree of sophistication to the board membership that you have.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. All right, so I think we're going to pivot into research.
Yeah, so I'll tee that up. So for those of you who do this work, I know Rachel uses for a living and teach others on the government grant side, but the researching of grants can be extremely time consuming, because what you're trying to do is find who's funding in your geographic area, how much are they giving away, is it worth my time to do this, and does it align, and who do we align most tightly with in terms of what we do, their funding interest. So I want Carol, just share your process with us. How do you start here? Where do you go to find potential funders? And then how do you research to make sure that your organization is going to make a competitive proposal at the end of the day?
I'm going to put something in the chat real quick because this is a good place to start if you're looking at research tools. But for the most part, a good subscription search tool can be helpful. So you want to be able to compare different kinds of search tools, what they do. And so what I put in the chat is a source that provides a little bit of a comparison between a few search tools. The most common one is Foundation Directory Online. It's a product of Candid, and it's probably the most widely known search tool, but I've also used Instrumental, which is actually a search tool that was developed by a scientist, realizing that as they were trying to find their own grant funding for their own research, they were struggling and decided it would create this database. It's really grown to be a very robust resource for all fields. And it's a very user-friendly interface. And that's the one I've used most recently. Foundation Search and GrantStation are two others that are relatively popular. You do not have to necessarily subscribe to yourself. While you can get a month-to-month or a year-long subscription, most public libraries and your county's community foundation have a grant research subscription service. Then so you can go there and have access for free. So that's a great little trick of the trade. You can spend some number of hours there over a period of time. And let me just say that I use as a rule of thumb about 10 hours to do a really good grant search and vetting process. Other ways so outside of subscription tools, I would also look to nonprofits with similar missions. Review their annual reports. You're stalking them a little bit. You want to look at their annual reports, go to their donor pages, find out who's funding them, and seeing if those foundations would align with what we're doing. Another source would be regional associations of grant makers. These are membership organizations, like here in my area, the Northern California Grant Makers Association is one. And of course, always talk to your current grant makers. Like, you've already got a relationship with them. They want to see you successful. They may be able to have a recommendation or can facilitate an introduction to someone in their network. So don't forget your current donors. And of course, talk to your board members, talk to your volunteers, etc. What are you looking for? So it's estimated that there are 86,000 grant-making entities in the US. So how do you find that needle, for goodness sakes? And how do you make it into a manageable list? And how many is the right number? So I like to start with some key search terms to at least get a fence around things. Geography, where does your grant maker prioritize? If they're only funding in Chicago, I found a great foundation that looked like, oh, I want to apply, but they only fund in Chicago. So it's a long shot to even try to approach them, no matter how much you think there's a fit and that they would just love to help us. If they're committed to Chicago, that's where they're going to stay. Fields of interest is another search term I would use for, you're looking for, a grant maker is funding in your area, like education, youth development, homelessness. You can look for sub-selections if you're using a database to narrow the field. So you can look at science education, for example. You might also want to use the search term for type of beneficiary. This could be young adults or academics, and some service subscriptions include higher education students within that academic classification. You might also want to look for subpopulations of youth, like Latinos or veterans. Grant size awards. Okay, so here, back when I was saying you don't want to ask for 50% of your overall budget need. But you do want to know what it is you want to be able to ask. And so you're looking for foundations that are going to be able to make a grant in that range. So if they're only doing $5,000 grants and you actually need 25,000 as an ask, maybe deprioritize the $5,000 grant maker. You also want to start with eliminating those, we do not accept unsolicited proposals. Start by eliminating those. And that's usually a checkbox that says, don't give me any of those, and see what you come up with. It's not impossible to approach someone that has a foundation that says, we only give to pre-selected organizations. The key is how to become one of those pre-selected organizations. And that's a longer process and requires some, effort to be introduced to or get yourself, submit a letter of introduction, et cetera, and go on from there. But so if my results are not robust, by eliminating that option, then I go back and I'll uncheck the box and see what comes up. And then that will direct my next steps. I ultimately aim to produce a list of 25 to 50 raw foundations, meaning having that just my first cut, because ultimately I want to get down to 10 to 15 strong candidates. That's a manageable amount for small organizations to consider applying to in over a year period or so. I want to check in on time. I can keep going here, but
We have about 15 minutes left.
okay, so we're good. All right.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about engagement with your board on those foundations that that are required for an introduction. How do we, I've done this in the past. It's somewhat successful sometimes, but I mean, that's a good place where volunteers can really help you and taking a look at those trustee lists. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that either, Carol, to add some more of those potentials to your list.
Through board members? So, yes, absolutely. Engaging with your board and other leadership in the organization, maybe you have an advisory council, et cetera. They are often already sit on other boards of nonprofits and might know of possible foundations. Having someone who might be able to open a door to you is also critical. I had a development director some number of years ago who we were just applying to anything and everything that felt like it was a good fit and really not getting any traction. And she said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to stop doing this, like throw the net out and see spaghetti on the wall, whatever sticks. And we are going to do everything we can to get an introduction. And we are only going to apply to those foundations with whom we have made a connection with in some way. So it's sort of, how do you want to spend your time? You can spend your time applying making cold proposals to anywhere and everywhere. That is one approach. Or you can be a little bit more strategic and really take the time to find those connections through your board members to make that first introduction, get the call with the program officer, have that half an hour of a call. It's like, this is what we're doing. This is why I think we're connected. We're aligned with with your foundation, what you're trying to do, and then go from there. I have one story that I just love to tell because it was about making that connection that we otherwise wouldn't have had happen. A way to get to be connected to a foundation is to go where they are. And just before we were getting on the call, Lori, I heard you and Diana talking about this luncheon happening that might have been a really good place to make that connection. It's like, oh, look who's here, and you can go up and introduce yourself. Well, that happened to me one time at a conference for grant professionals, and there was a presentation being done by a program officer at a foundation that I know that I've been wanting to get connected to and couldn't find an in. And there she was. I had my question ready. And after the end of the session, I walked up to her and I said, here's my question. Would you be willing to talk with me later? And she said, yes, she would. And that short story is that led to them coming to the campus to get to know the faculty who are doing research in the area. We ended up having our dean go and for a visit when she was traveling back east to we arranged for a meeting with that same program officer at their office. Ultimately, we ended up submitting a grant that we awarded, a six-figure six-figure grant. So it was exciting, but it was a process, and that was 18 months. So that's the other thing to keep in mind. Grant development work does require patience and tenacity and just continued creativity to find the door to get into. But getting in that door can be the make or break opportunity, and you'd be surprised then at what comes after.
Yeah, it is a relationship. You know, when I first started in this business, I thought grant writers just sat behind their desks and typesetted. And so as I've evolved over the years, I'm like, oh, this is very relational, and having a tight relationship with your program officer is one of the best relationships you can have to continue those to continue the flow of support to your organization.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Carol, we have about 10 more minutes. I wanted to ask about something that has happened to me a lot, and I think it's probably pretty common. But what if you really don't, you're researching and, the funder says, we want to make everybody in the world happy, or whatever, one of those, very gray funding statements that really doesn't give you what you need to understand if you're a good candidate or a good partner for them. What do you do with that? I mean, how do you move through that that gray area to understand if do you reach out to the program? I mean, what do you do?
Yes, absolutely. So we might think we're a great fit, but we look at their record of funding, grant making, and we're like, well, I can see this and I can see that, but it's still not really clear, but I really think so. Absolutely, you would want to be able to have that conversation. You don't want to waste your time. It takes a lot of time to put a grant together, a strong grant. And so you don't want to waste your time and you don't want to waste their time. And so many foundations would be very open if they make themselves available through putting their phone number or their email on the website, what have you. But yes, having that conversation can be very valuable to the understanding whether it's worth the effort to pursue a grant. The challenge really is finding that person again, because many smaller foundations are not visible. They don't want to be contacted because they'll be they'll be inundated with people trying to reach out to them. So it's not a matter of not wanting to talk to you. It's a matter of just managing their capacity to do so. One way you can approach them is a letter of introduction. That is different than a letter of inquiry. A letter of introduction is not an ask. It's a letter of inquiry is like a very abbreviated grant proposal. A letter of introduction is saying, hey, I saw you. I think there's a fit. Let me explain briefly why I think that's a fit for us. If you're able to contact me, would love to talk with you more about it. So letter of introductions can be a valuable tool and would be your tool of choice if you want to be one of those pre-selected organizations, right? That's one way to get introduced.
Yeah, I've done those in an email form these days, and it's been pretty hit or miss, mostly miss, because like you said, they get emails from everywhere. So
Right.
they're sifting
Yes,
through.
you're right. I'm using the old-fashioned term of a letter.
No, I'm down with that. That's how I started. I'm remembering having to run a FedEx package down somewhere so I could hit my grant submission deadline. I'm like, thank God we don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah.
So we have a couple more minutes, and I want to open it up for questions. And I see Aletha, you have a question in here. So this is for you, Carol. Does it help to have a company person as a member or board member? Say a bank or local company that gives grants?
So I think the question is, does it help to have a company person as a member or board member? Oh, of our, okay. Well, it certainly can. Again, that person would be able to inform as to whether or not that this is a good fit. I think having any kind of a connection to a foundation is like your needle, is really what you're hoping. How you can leverage that relationship is really something that you need to work with through that particular person. Talk to them about whether or not they're able to help you. I don't want to go so far to say that there might be a conflict of interest, but it just sort of does depend on whether or not that person is in a position to facilitate a next step for you with that foundation that they work for. I hope I answered that question.
Aletha, if you still have a follow-on, just go ahead and type that in the chat there. You know, I also have a question, but we don't have enough time to go here. It's the go, no go conversations that you have in bigger organizations. Like, how do you determine with your team if we should go after this money, right? Because not all money, can we spend it like we need to in the timeline, and do we have staff to deliver on all? So all those questions, which, you know, I wasn't really exposed to that until I was in healthcare. And we're like, oh, all this money is coming out for COVID. How do we get it? But not only how do we get it, the getting was easy back then, but it was the spending of it. And then since it was federal tax dollars, it's like you really have some reporting to do. So that to me is a whole other like sifting through of understanding what money you want to go after in grants and what may not be good for your organization at this time.
Yeah, that is a big question to answer in a couple of minutes. But as you were talking, I did find a project budget, if you still wanted me to share that.
Oh, yes, please.
Okay. But you'll have to tell me how you gonna give?
You can just email it to me and Alex will send that out.
Oh, okay. Rather than share screen. Got it. Okay.
So since we don't have any more questions in the chat, I was going to invite Diana back. She wanted to close out the session for us today. So
I think Aletha just did raise another question. Do we want?
Yes.
So
So Aletha asked, how can members be further educated regarding grant writing or helping staff with the process? So we have a session coming up tomorrow on that at ARCS Oregon, Aletha. So you're welcome. I think you've signed up for it. So this is you know, Carol helped us get our feet wet in the area, but I think it's we'll start tomorrow doing some more deep diving into that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's also just talking it through. I think there's so much mythology and misinformation about grant development that just sitting down and having these kind of conversations, say, look, here's the complexity of doing a grant work. But as you said, it has a high return on investment if your organization is willing to make that upfront commitment to getting all of those things in place so that you can put a strong proposal together that really resonates and sets yourself apart from all the other grants that a foundation is receiving. So conversations.
Thank you, Carol. I'm punting it to you now, Diana, to
All
close.
right. Well, first of all, Carol, my goodness, thank you so much. My brain is full. I'm going to have to go back and watch the recording of this to get everything you said. Thank you for giving us the benefit of your expertise. It's greatly, greatly appreciated. When Northern California is lucky to have you. We're lucky to have Lori, who is also striving to do this up here in Oregon, and we're coming along. And I think, you know, probably the ultimate way that we're going to learn how to do this is to do this, right? And so it's exciting to be on the cusp of starting this important work. So to those in our audience, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you've enjoyed this series of talks that has been related to building a development program that will really perform. And we've been working on other additional Lunch and Learn topics, and we'll of course, let you know of these additional sessions as soon as they are in place. But we also want to ask you if you have anything that you'd like to hear about. Let us know. I put my address and in the chat. I'm going to type it in again right here so that it's easy for you. Just drop me a line and look at me doing two things at once. Sort of. I hope I did that right. Drop me a line, let me know of topics that you might be interested in, and we'd be happy to consider those. So thank you so much. Big, huge thank you again to Carol. Thank you to Lori for overseeing and organizing the series of talks. They've been just incredibly informative, and I look forward to the next series, and I hope you do too. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Bye.